The year was 1218. Genghis Khan was at the height of his strength, ruler of the largest and most disciplined mounted force the world had seen. Across the deserts and mountains to the southwest, the Khwarezmian Empire thrived. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, a land of prosperous cities, libraries, scholars, and silk. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, had grown rich off trade, and with that wealth came pride and arrogance. He believed the Mongols were beneath him, barbaric, primitive, not a threat. But the Shah's underestimation would be one of the deadliest miscalculations in history. Genghis didn't seek war. Not at first. The Mongols had conquered the northern Silk Road and now wanted to open peaceful relations to the south. Trade was wealth, and Genghis knew it. So he sent a caravan of merchants, 500 men with gold, spices, and fine wool, to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. But the governor there, Inalchuk, viewed them with suspicion. He claimed they were spies and seized their goods. Worse, he executed them. Every last one. Word of this insult reached Genghis, who was furious but restrained. He sent 3 ambassadors to negotiate peace, a final warning. Shah Muhammad II received them and had them killed. One was beheaded, the others humiliated and sent back. It wasn't just an act of aggression. It was a spit in the face of Mongol diplomacy, a rejection of Genghis's authority. No ruler had done that and survived. The Shah believed his empire's cities, walls, and soldiers would protect him. He believed Mongols could not cross deserts or siege fortresses. He believed wrong. Genghis called his generals, Subutai, Jeep, Talyui, Chagatai, the best of the Mongol command. They didn't meet in courts or temples. They gathered on horseback in the steppe winds and listened as their Khan declared the plan. Not for mere revenge, but for utter annihilation. Not just to destroy armies, but to erase an empire from the map. It wasn't rage. It was strategy, and it would begin with fire. The Mongol army moved in winter when no one expected it, across the deadly Karakum Desert. Guided by captured scouts and old maps, they came in multiple columns. Some went north through the Sir Darya, others south along the Oxus. The Khwarezm forces were split, trying to defend every city. Mongols didn't hit one target. They hit many, like lightning across dry grass. Otrar, the city that killed the merchants, was first. It was surrounded, isolated, and starved. Genghis's siege engineers, learned from Chinese wars, breached the walls after 5 months. The governor Inalchuk was captured alive. Genghis ordered molten silver poured into his eyes and mouth. A message. One city down. Bukhara came next. A cultural jewel, filled with scholars, books, and mosques. Genghis entered it without mercy. He spared no one except artisans and those who surrendered immediately. He climbed the pulpit of the main mosque and declared that he was the scourge of God, sent as punishment for sin. That message would echo across the Muslim world. Bukhara's defenders had boasted of numbers and walls. Neither saved them. Samarkand, the Khwarezm capital, held a larger garrison, 100,000 men, well-armed, with elephants and war machines. But morale crumbled. Genghis used captured deserters, siege towers, and deception. He broke their lines and stormed the citadel. The city fell within days. The elephants were driven into panic by fire arrows, trampling their own. The defenders scattered. The Mongols executed tens of thousands. The empire was losing cities faster than it could defend them. The Shah fled, first west, then south, chased by Mongol detachments that harassed his trail day and night. He trusted no one. He had betrayed his people with his pride, and now no city welcomed him. In the snows of the Caspian coast, he died alone on an island, hunted to his last breath. But his son, Jalal al-Din, remained. And unlike his father, Jalal al-Din would fight. He gathered loyal soldiers, survivors, mercenaries, tribal warriors, and in the hills near Ghazni and the Indus, he rebuilt a force, 100,000 strong, the last hope of a crumbling empire. The Mongols watched, waited, and planned. They had one more lesson to teach, not in letters, in blood. The spring of 1221 brought heat, wind, and movement. Genghis Khan's forces were no longer chasing shadows. They were calculating the next cut. Jalal al-Din's army had swelled. The son of the dead Shah had rallied broken garrisons, tribal contingents from the Hindu Kush, Turkic horsemen, even mercenaries from defeated provinces. He promised revenge. He promised to stand where his father had fled. His army was disciplined, armed, and ready, but he was still facing the Mongols. Jalal al-Din chose the terrain carefully. South of the Hindu Kush, in the harsh, rocky lands near the Indus River, he fortified his position. He knew Genghis was coming, and he believed he could hold the pass, use the terrain to his advantage. His soldiers dug in, confident that numbers, position, and morale would stop the Mongols cold. But Jalal didn't fully understand what was coming toward him. The Mongols didn't just fight. They orchestrated destruction. Genghis sent light cavalry first, feinting and retreating in small bands. These were not random skirmishes. They were measured probes. They tested Jalal's response time, his patrol patterns, his movement speed. The Mongols mapped the Khwarezm army's blind spots by pretending to flee. They let themselves be chased. They scattered into narrow valleys where they seemed to vanish. Jalal believed he was pushing them back. His scouts reported victories. Spirits rose in his camp. But the victories were illusions. The Mongols had studied the terrain. They had spent weeks ahead of the main confrontation preparing the field, carving hidden paths into the rock, placing hidden riders in dry creek beds, caching arrows, food, water, even extra horses. They turned the Indus Valley into a trap with 100 jaws. It was not a battlefield. It was a mechanism, and Genghis was pulling the levers. Then came the day. Jalal's army, in tight formation, marched into a narrow stretch of valley flanked by steep ridges and dry arroyos. Scouts had seen Mongols retreating into this zone the night before. It seemed like the final push would break their backs. Officers barked orders. Drums thundered. The army surged forward, and the valley swallowed them. From the high cliffs, Mongol archers emerged silently, released a rain of arrows, and vanished again behind rocks. Down in the valley, panic began to take root. Cavalry tried to charge forward, but found choke points blocked by sudden avalanches of stone and sand, unleashed by Mongol saboteurs. Rear units turned back to escape, only to find other detachments of Mongols already cutting off retreat. The Khwarezm army was no longer moving. It was trapped. Genghis timed the next wave with precision. Drums pounded from the hills. Horns blew from 3 directions. Mongol heavy cavalry, held in reserve, now thundered down from hidden paths. The horses moved like black water, flooding from above and behind. Their lances found soft flesh. Their sabers severed lines of command. The Khwarezm formation, once solid and disciplined, disintegrated under the weight of chaos. The Mongols didn't attack in a single wave. They hit, pulled back, circled, and hit again, each time targeting officers, signalers, and engineers. They knew the anatomy of an army, and they dismantled it piece by piece. Jalal's flanks buckled. His right collapsed under a false retreat, where a Mongol detachment lured his cavalry into a basin and then ambushed them with fire arrows and pit traps. Every attempt to regroup failed. Every retreat path ended in ambush. Mongol detachments had split the field into kill zones, and none led to safety. The Khwarezm soldiers could not see their commanders. Orders were garbled, signals misread, units fighting blindly. Hundreds drowned in the Indus, trying to flee. Hundreds more were trampled by their own panicking comrades. Arrows found those who ran. Sabers claimed those who stood. It was a complete systemic collapse. The Mongols had weaponized psychology, not just fear, but confusion, dislocation, despair. By late afternoon, the Khwarezm army no longer existed as a fighting force. It was a collection of desperate men in a death field. Pockets of resistance formed, but were snuffed out. Some tried to surrender, but Mongol doctrine allowed no such mercy in cases of betrayal. The slaughter was total. Jalal al-Din fought at the center, surrounded by his elite guard. He killed Mongols with his own blade. His armor was soaked in blood, not his own. He called for regrouping, but no one came. He stood on a ridge and saw the dust and carnage stretch for miles. Spears broken, flags trampled, bodies burned. The Indus below reflected the red sky like a mirror made of blood. The sun began to set, and with it, any trace of the Khwarezmian army. 70,000 lay dead or dying by dusk. The valley echoed with the screams of the wounded and the distant snorting of Mongol horses. Fires flickered across the ridge where wagons burned. A few thousand survivors managed to crawl away into caves, gullies, or across the river. But they were not spared. The Mongols swept the area for days, finishing what they had begun. This wasn't just a battle. It was an erasure, a civilization's defense crushed in a day. And Genghis stood above it all, calm, observing, recording. He had executed vengeance, not just with fury, but with design. The son of a murdered diplomat had become the destroyer of an empire. And still, Jalal al-Din breathed. Still, he resisted. But his strength was gone. His army was gone. And his place in history had been carved. Not as the savior of his people, but as the last man standing in a field of ghosts. Jalal al-Din stood alone on the final ridge of the battlefield, his horse trembling beneath him, nostrils flaring, flanks streaked with blood that was not its own. Around him, the last of his guards had fallen. Corpses lay piled at the slope's edge. Men who had followed him from Nishapur, from Samarkand, from the shattered ruins of Khwarezm's former glory. The son of the Shah had refused to flee until the end. He had fought like a warlord, like a lion cornered in a cave. But now he was surrounded. Below, the Indus River snaked like a ribbon of steel, wide, dark, and cold. Behind him, the Mongol vanguard approached in silence. No shouting, no threats. They didn't need to intimidate him. They had already defeated everything he stood for. Genghis Khan himself watched from a distant rise, arms folded, unmoving. He had followed the engagement all day without intervening. He didn't need to. The machine he had built functioned with terrifying efficiency. Jalal al-Din knew he was finished. He had three options: surrender, die where he stood, or try the impossible. He chose the river. Spurring his horse, he galloped toward the edge. Arrows hissed past. Some grazed his shoulder, others splashed around him as he plunged into the Indus, the horse kicking madly beneath him. Armor dragged him down. Blood streamed from his wounds, coloring the water. But he kept moving. Stroke by stroke, he fought the current. His horse thrashed beside him, its eyes wide with terror. On the far bank, a few of his men, those few who had broken through earlier, were waving frantically. The Mongols did not pursue into the river. Genghis Khan raised his hand, signaling the archers to hold. He had seen something rare, dignity in defeat. Not cowardice, not retreat, a warrior's final act. He allowed it, not out of compassion, but out of respect. Jalal al-Din reached the far bank half-drowned, wounded, and weaponless. He did not collapse. He stood. Water poured from his torn cloak. His sword was gone, but he still carried the weight of his legacy. From that moment, he became a symbol, one of the few who had faced the Mongol storm and lived. But his escape did not undo the disaster. Behind him, the valley of the Indus was quiet now. Smoke curled from the remains of carts. Buzzards circled overhead. The Mongols moved systematically across the battlefield, collecting spoils, salvaging weapons, killing the last of the wounded. They took no prisoners, and they left no survivors who could be identified as officers. This wasn't a victory. It was a message burned into the earth with ash and steel. The campaign was not yet over. Genghis Khan had struck down the Khwarezmian dynasty, but his war machine had momentum. Detachments moved west toward Persia, east toward India, and south toward the last loyal cities. Those places that had watched the destruction from afar now understood what was coming. The sultans of Ghor, the lords of Lahore, the emirates of the Punjab. They heard the numbers. 70,000 dead in a single day. Some didn't believe it. Those who did began digging deeper moats and preparing for siege. But none would forget the image. A single rider, blood-soaked, diving into the Indus to escape annihilation, and the army that disappeared behind him. In the Mongol camp, there was no celebration. Victory was a tool, not a cause for indulgence. Genghis Khan walked the battlefield on foot, inspecting the damage, noting the terrain. His scribes followed silently, recording what had worked, what had failed, what could be improved. Discipline held. There were no drunken feasts, no uncontrolled looting. Everything had purpose. Every movement, even after the bloodletting, was about control. The Great Khan was teaching the world a new language of war. He had taken a fragmented nomadic culture and turned it into the sharpest blade history had ever seen. The ambush at the Indus was not an accident. It was the result of years of experimentation, refinement, punishment, and vision. The Mongol military wasn't just brutal, it was engineered. Modular units, internal signaling, supply chains, field forges, mobile camps, intelligence networks. It wasn't just cavalry with bows. It was a system designed to end civilizations. The Khwarezmian Empire had learned that too late. Their cities, once proud jewels of Central Asia, now lay in ruins. Libraries burned, markets emptied, waterways choked with ash. It hadn't taken decades of siege warfare. It had taken one insult and 3 years of response. And the response culminated not with a siege, not with a treaty, but with a single day, when 100,000 marched and less than a third ever breathed again. The survivors told the story. They carried it in their eyes, in the silence that followed them. They spoke of warriors who rode like ghosts and disappeared like wind. They spoke of arrows that fell like rain, of drums that sounded like thunder, and of generals who seemed to know every move before it was made. But most of all, they spoke of the valley, the place where time stopped, where the sun fell faster, and where even the gods seemed to look away. In the weeks that followed, the dust of the Indus battlefield settled into the blood-soaked earth, and vultures darkened the skies. But Genghis Khan was not idle. The valley had served its purpose, an execution ground for an empire's final breath, but it was only one phase in his broader design. With Jalal al-Din escaping, the Khwarezmian name still had a pulse, however faint. That was unacceptable. A corpse with a crown could still breed rebellion. So Genghis turned to the next phase of destruction, the dismantling of memory itself. He divided his forces, not out of necessity, but strategy. Mongol armies, built for speed and independence, operated like swarms. Each division carried its own logistics, its own commanders, its own objectives. One rode south to secure the fords and passes into the Indian subcontinent, where Jalal al-Din had fled. Another moved westward, chasing the remnants of Khwarezmian loyalists who had scattered into the Persian highlands. Yet another swept north, burning villages that had given even minor aid to the Shah. None were spared. Genghis was not hunting armies anymore. He was hunting memory. In the city of Multan, local governors who had once corresponded with the Shah found their letters pinned to the walls, surrounded by their severed heads. In Ghazni, poets who had written verses in honor of Khwarezm's golden age were pulled from their homes and killed in the street. Town criers were forced to recite new proclamations, that there was no longer a Shah, no longer a kingdom, and that resistance was death. The psychological campaign had begun, but it wasn't just fear that spread, it was awe. Stories began circulating, even among those untouched by the war, of the discipline of the Mongols. How they moved as one, how they shared rations with precision, how scouts rode hundreds of kilometers and returned with memory-perfect terrain details, and how, after such a colossal battle, the army didn't break into chaos or indulgence, but immediately reformed ranks and moved to the next objective. It defied every rule of medieval warfare. No feast, no looting, just forward motion. Behind them, they left not just ruins, but altered landscapes. Irrigation channels were smashed. Wells were poisoned. Trees were cut to deprive future rebels of wood. In some regions, entire agricultural systems collapsed. Where the Mongols passed, famine followed. Not as a weapon, but as a byproduct of efficiency. And yet, Genghis had no interest in governing the wreckage. He didn't hold court in the conquered cities. He didn't stay to rebuild palaces. His gaze was always beyond the horizon. His mission was clarity itself. destroy the idea that anyone could strike a Mongol envoy and live. Everything else was secondary. As his armies continued their advance, they didn't carry banners of ideology or religion. They carried precision, maps etched in memory, marching orders coded into knots and string. They carried speed. Horses rotated every few hours. Riders moved day and night. They didn't wait for battles. They brought them on their own terms in places where no one expected war. Word reached Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. Envoys reported what had happened in the east. Kings and caliphs questioned the numbers. 70,000 dead in one day? An entire army erased? Surely not. But then survivors began arriving. Emaciated, broken, their stories aligning. Their accounts didn't focus on glory or even resistance. They spoke of a valley where sound vanished, where the Mongols didn't shout or boast, where they simply killed and moved on. And at the center of these stories, always, was the figure of Genghis Khan. Not a monarch in robes, not a man of ceremony. A commander who rode with his men, slept on the ground, punished theft, rewarded skill, and demanded obedience. A man who understood that fear fades, but destruction leaves a shape in history that endures. Jalal al-Din, meanwhile, moved deeper into India. He attempted to rally allies among the Rajput kingdoms and Delhi sultanates. Some welcomed him. Most feared the curse he carried. He was not a conqueror to them. He was a marked man, shadowed by a wrath that crossed rivers and mountains. He found no armies willing to join him in open war. Only broken warriors, fugitives, and zealots. He tried to raise another force. Small raids, border attacks. For a time, he carved a name for himself in the Punjab, but he never again commanded the strength he once had at the industry. His great moment had passed. His blade had flashed against history once, and then the wave had crashed over it. Meanwhile, Genghis didn't even send more soldiers after him. The Khan knew time would do the job. Jalal was no threat anymore. He was a warning left alive. And in the wake of the Indus massacre, Genghis turned his attention elsewhere. The Khwarezm campaign had taught the world that Mongol vengeance was not a strike. It was an extinction-level event. But it had also taught Genghis something crucial, that empires, even rich and ancient ones, could fall with terrifying speed if they underestimated the will to destroy. So he planned anew. The next targets would not be small kingdoms. They would be civilizations that thought themselves eternal. Because the Mongols had moved beyond war, they were rewriting the rules of existence. South of the Indus, Jalal al-Din's world shrank. Once a prince with vast cities and a legacy behind him, now he was little more than a fugitive lord. Though he remained defiant, his resources dwindled with each month. He had no access to the tax base of a functioning state. No tribute came from former provinces. Those had either been obliterated by Mongol hands or had switched loyalty in fear. His army, once 100,000 strong, had been reduced to scattered survivors, desperate mercenaries, and tribal fighters who viewed him as a temporary banner rather than a sovereign. In the courts of northern India, he became a cautionary tale, the shadow of a man who once dared to resist Genghis Khan. Jalal sought alliance with the Ghurids, and even flirted with appeals to the Delhi Sultanate. But these overtures were half-hearted on both sides. The rulers of India were shrewd. They understood what followed in the Mongols' wake. Accepting Jalal al-Din as an ally might invite the Khan's fury across the passes into their own domains. They saw the cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Nishapur, Bukhara, no longer as rivals but as ghost towns. They had witnessed the refugee tide, the broken merchants, the mutilated scholars. No one wanted to invite that fire into their gates. Genghis Khan, for his part, watched this unfold without interference. He didn't need to send a second wave to finish Jalal. His work was already complete. What had been the Khwarezmian Empire was now a fragmented mess of tribal fiefdoms, petty rulers, and haunted survivors. The larger mission of Genghis was advancing elsewhere, toward the Caucasus, toward the steppes of the Rus, toward the gates of the Islamic heartlands. But in the silence following the Indus ambush, the very idea of resistance had begun to corrode across the Muslim world. In the former Khwarezmian cities, Ashes covered what had once been centers of learning. The madrasas had been torched. The markets emptied. Roads once trafficked by caravans were now used by foragers picking through charred bones. Where records were spared, Mongol officials, scribes imported from China and Persia, copied them and sent them eastward. Everything useful was extracted. Everything else was discarded. Entire towns were repurposed into staging grounds for further conquest. A new kind of horror also began to spread: statistical dread. For the first time in history, people started quantifying death, not just as numbers, but as precedent. 70,000 dead in one day. The phrase passed from merchant lips to mosque pulpits, from refugee mouths to the ears of generals. Governors who once dared to negotiate from strength now trembled when a Mongol envoy approached. Some surrendered before a single arrow was loosed. Cities threw open their gates, offered hostages, maps, translators, tribute, and horses, all just to avoid the fate of the Indus. Genghis didn't always accept. Mercy was not a guarantee. It was a tool. He used it when it served the larger campaign. If a city's surrender would create panic among its neighbors, he accepted and spared it. If leniency might embolden others, he raised everything. The unpredictability made his wrath feel divine, and that ambiguity was perhaps more terrifying than any sword. Among the Mongols, the memory of the Indus was not spoken with triumph, but with calculation. It was a model, not for mere victory, but for operational perfection. The generals studied it like engineers. Subutai noted the flanking timings down to the hour. Jeeb analyzed the topography for future traps. Talyui recalculated the distribution of arrows, water, and fodder. It was not just a massacre. It was an algorithm of death, and now it could be replicated. It soon would be, but before that, the memory had to be sealed. So Genghis did one final thing. He ordered the valley cleansed. The bodies, already rotting in the heat, were gathered into heaps. Survivors were forced to dig pits, then slaughtered to fill them. Bones were broken, looted items buried, horses driven over the shallow graves to flatten the terrain. No monument was raised, no inscription left, nothing to mark the site of the greatest single-day destruction of an army in recorded history. Only silence. To Genghis, this was not erasure. It was completion, for he understood something most conquerors never grasped. Memory does not need a monument. It needs a wound, and the Indus was exactly that. A wound cut so deep across the Muslim world that it would throb for generations. Even as Jalal al-Din lived out his years, trying to rebuild a resistance, the empire he had inherited no longer existed in any real sense. It had been broken not at its capital, but in a nameless ravine filled with broken spears and silent corpses. Meanwhile, the Silk Road adjusted to new masters. Where once Khwarezmian taxes were collected, Mongol agents now operated. Their rule was efficient, brutal, but predictable. Merchants appreciated the safety of the reopened trade routes, provided they didn't offend. Many noted the strange duality of it all. Genghis the destroyer had become Genghis the stabilizer. The man who annihilated an empire in a day now protected commerce more diligently than any caliph or king had ever done. But beneath the trade, beneath the order, lay the knowledge of what had been done. What was possible? That a man with a memory and a cause could erase 100,000 souls from history, not with rage, but with planning. And that should he ever feel insulted again, the earth itself would shift to make room for more graves. Years passed. Jalal al-Din, once heir to a great empire, wandered deeper into the fractured landscape of northern India, a man out of place in a world that no longer wanted him. His name still carried fear and legend, but no longer authority. He was a warrior without a realm, a commander without supply lines, a prince without people. The former Khwarezmian soldiers who had escaped with him after the Indus ambush either died in scattered skirmishes, settled among local tribes, or drifted into banditry. The Mongols had severed every artery of his former world. What survived of his name was myth, not power. He fought minor campaigns in the Punjab, leading desperate charges against regional rulers, surviving ambushes and betrayals. He tried to plant roots, to start again, to rebuild some semblance of court and command. But the fear of Mongol reprisal followed him everywhere. Even the most warlike Indian lords hesitated to stand beside a man who had been marked by Genghis Khan. To host Jalal al-Din was to invite annihilation, and the memory of the Indus massacre made that threat very real. He eventually retreated into the mountains. There, among crags and old fortresses, he faded from the global stage. But he never forgot the trauma of that one day, of watching his entire army unravel in smoke, steel, and screams, was a weight no exile could shake. He carried it not only as loss, but as purpose. In his heart, he still sought vengeance. But vengeance requires means, and Jalal had none left. Meanwhile, far from the ruins of Khwarezm and the mountains of the Punjab, the Mongol Empire continued its expansion. Genghis Khan did not linger to admire what he had done. He did not build palaces on the rubble of his enemies. He moved on, always forward. The ambush near the Indus had served its purpose. It had taught a lesson to the world. Insult a Mongol, and your descendants will speak of it only in ashes. But its true legacy was in the transformation of how war itself was understood. Before Genghis, battle was often ritualistic. Clashes were seasonal, fought under codes of honor. Sieges lasted months, often ending in negotiated surrender. Armies respected festivals, paused for harvests, observed religious rest days. Genghis rejected all of it. He waged war with no calendar, no holidays, no hesitation. The ambush at the Indus exemplified this, a masterstroke of timing, psychology, and terrain. There was no ceremony, no honor in the traditional sense, just results. And the Mongol generals studied it meticulously. They used it as precedent. Subutai, in campaigns years later, would employ nearly identical bait-and-destroy maneuvers against the Rus and the Poles. Jebe, in his lightning-fast raids into Georgia and Armenia, repeated the same misdirection tactics: pretend retreat, draw the enemy in, strike from three sides. The blueprint was set at the industry, but it was no longer just strategy, it was doctrine. Genghis didn't rely on luck. He built systems. His commanders were trained not merely to obey, but to adapt, to innovate, to calculate risks as they rode. Communication across hundreds of kilometers was maintained using flags, arrows, horns, smoke, every method imaginable. Orders could move faster than news, and that meant when an enemy advanced, he was almost always walking into a trap already laid weeks prior. What happened to the Khwarezmian army was not a one-off event. It was proof of concept, but no ambush since ever matched its scale. That day near the Indus remained singular. The largest Mongol ambush, the most concentrated loss of life in a single engagement of their entire campaign. Later cities would fall, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, but those were sieges spread over time. What marked the Indus was the speed. An army annihilated in hours. A whole generation of warriors crushed into the dirt by twilight. Back in the lands once held by Khwarezm, the social order had dissolved. Without an emperor, power became fragmented. The elite families had been executed, their lands redistributed by Mongol hands or razed entirely. Universities and schools that once educated thousands were gone. Trade stalled, artisans disappeared, and language itself began to shift. Under Mongol oversight, Turkic dialects mixed with Mongol phrases. New scripts appeared. Old family names vanished. Genealogies were severed. Memory itself became unreliable. And that was the final echo of the ambush. Not the slaughter, not the river of blood, but the erasure. The Mongols hadn't just killed soldiers. They had decapitated an entire civilization. No libraries remained to retell the full story. No monks preserved the archives. Even among later Persian historians, the details of the Khwarezmian fall had to be reconstructed from fragments, spoken accounts, scattered refugee testimonies, secondhand memories. The sheer completeness of the destruction had made chronicling it nearly impossible, and that silence became its own monument. The Mongol campaign moved on to Persia, to Baghdad, to the steppes of the West. But what they left behind in that valley remained untouched by time. No stone pillars, no names carved into granite, just a stretch of ground, bare and unremarkable, beneath which lay 70,000 dead, and above which passed the whispers of history. Even centuries later, when empires rose and fell, when the Mongol dynasty fractured and gave way to successors, the story of the Indus remained. Scholars wrote of it in half-belief, wondering how so many could be destroyed so quickly. Some doubted the numbers, others doubted the tactics. But the consistency of fear across regions confirmed the truth. The terror was real. Genghis Khan died in 1227, 6 years after the Indus, but the system he created endured. His sons and grandsons would use the methods perfected there to carve out the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And every time a city hesitated to open its gates, every time a ruler debated resisting, someone would invoke the name of Jalal al-Din. And someone would whisper what had happened on that nameless day in the valley. No declarations, no treaties, just a storm that came, swallowed an army whole, and moved on as if it had done nothing at all. By the 1230s, the world had shifted. Borders, once considered eternal, had been rearranged by hooves and fire. The Mongol Empire was no longer a mere rising power. It was the axis around which Eurasia turned. And still, across the shattered frontiers of the Islamic world, the trauma of the Khwarezmian collapse lingered. Its echo was heard not in fortresses or palaces, but in absence. Absence of resistance, absence of voice, absence of legacy. What had once been the Khwarezmian Empire, spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, had been reduced to a name, a cautionary term spoken in the marketplaces of Aleppo and the caravanserais of Bukhara. When merchants discussed risky ventures, they used Khwarezm as a metaphor. Don't draw the wrath of the storm, they'd say. Don't speak to the wind, as the Shah once did. The physical destruction of cities was visible, but what was harder to grasp and far more permanent was the psychological collapse. The population had been shattered in its understanding of security. The idea that walled cities could protect them, that dynastic rule brought safety, that diplomatic status prevented slaughter, all of it had crumbled on that day near the Indus. For those who live in the lands once ruled by Shah Muhammad II, the post-war reality was colder than conquest. It was recalibration. Mongol governors, often drawn from the ranks of Genghis's trusted lieutenants or adopted subjects, imposed a strict yet surprisingly efficient rule. Taxes were collected with ruthless precision, but also with predictability. Unlike the arbitrary greed of fallen local warlords, the Mongol system operated on quotas, not whim. But there was no illusion of freedom. Disobedience meant collective punishment. Delay meant replacement of people, entire villages, bloodlines. Artisans were spared more often than not. Engineers, scribes, blacksmiths, these the Mongols relocated rather than executed. And it was from this policy that a second transformation emerged, a redistribution of skills. The finest minds of Persia, Central Asia, and even parts of India were plucked from their homes and resettled in the Mongol heartlands. Some were sent east to Karakoram, others north to newly established trade posts in the steppes. These men and women, while technically spared, were functionally severed from their heritage. They became agents of a new world, skilled hands building the infrastructure of an empire that had annihilated their own. Jalal al-Din, still alive though diminished, understood this better than most. He had failed to rebuild any lasting authority in India. The local kingdoms used him when convenient and discarded him when the threat of Mongol retribution loomed. In 1231, over a decade after the ambush, he made a final return to Persia, not as a ruler, but as a wandering commander hoping to capitalize on new instability in the west. But time had passed him by. Genghis was dead. The empire now followed Ogdi, Genghis's chosen successor, and the machinery of Mongol expansion had only grown more precise. Jalal led a few small campaigns, capturing territory in parts of western Persia briefly. But the forces he encountered were no longer unprepared. Even those who feared the Mongols had learned from them. Tactical awareness had evolved. The surprise he once wielded had vanished. He was not a returning king. He was a remnant, a footnote. And in 1231, in the Zagros Mountains, his life was cut short. Not by Mongol hands, but by an assassin from a rival Muslim faction. His body fell into obscurity. No mausoleum was raised. No kingdom wept. He died not as a prince, but as a fighter in a land that had forgotten what he once represented. And yet his image endured, not for what he ruled, but for what he survived. The Mongol chronicles never feared Jalal al-Din, but they noted his defiance. Genghis himself, even in private reflection, had once called him a man of courage. The leap into the Indus, that flash of decision against the jaws of annihilation, had earned him a strange place in Mongol memory, not as a threat, but as a worthy opponent. That rarest of titles, yet even that honor could not undo the fate of his people. The children of the Khwarezmian elite who had survived the collapse often found themselves as scribes in Mongol courts or slaves in foreign households. The memory of their fathers, the officers slaughtered in the valley, was passed in whispers, not in books. Families changed their names. Women who once wore silk and jewelry now carried water for steppe camps. An entire social order had reversed itself. What once had been civilization's spine was now its displaced shadow. And still, the Mongol Empire expanded. In the years that followed, as the sons of Genghis rode into Russia, as Bata Khan sacked Kiev, as Hulagu moved toward Baghdad, the shadow of the Indus massacre informed every campaign. Not because the generals invoked it directly, but because the principles it represented had become law. Speed, deception, multi-directional assault, psychological collapse, complete follow-through. The memory was not preserved in scrolls. It was preserved in bloodlines that no longer existed. By mid-century, even those who had heard first-hand accounts of the ambush had mostly died. The battlefield itself, once thick with corpses and carrion birds, had returned to silence. Grass grew where blades had fallen. Travelers passed the area without realizing the ground beneath them was a crypt of an empire. No monument marked the spot. No nation claimed it. But the Mongols remembered, not as pride, but as precedent. And every empire that rose in the Mongol aftermath, from the Timurids to the Mongols, carried that scar in their foundations. Their rulers spoke of stability, of power, of God's will. But none forgot what happened when Genghis Khan sent no reply. Just silence, and an army. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Mongol world had changed. The unified empire Genghis Khan forged had splintered into khanates, each ruled by his sons and grandsons. The Golden Horde in the northwest, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These were now states with borders, administrators, currency, and ambassadors. The time of explosive conquest had slowed, but the legacy of that conquest, particularly the annihilation of Khwarezm, lingered like smoke over the entire Islamic world. In madrasas from Anatolia to India, scholars debated what had gone wrong. How could a proud empire fall so completely, so quickly? They pored over what little had survived, fragments of manuscripts, partial lists of fallen cities, recollections of refugees whose stories had become distorted with time. But again and again, they returned to the same moment. The ambush near the Indus, when 70,000 men vanished in the span of a single day. That was no ordinary battle. That was the fulcrum. No sultan since had dared treat Mongol diplomats with contempt. The memory of Shah Muhammad II's arrogance was a ghost that walked the corridors of every court. Rulers who once executed foreign envoys without thought now cloaked themselves in diplomacy, fearing that a wrong word could unleash fire across their provinces. The entire culture of Islamic diplomacy was reshaped not by treaty, but by massacre. The protocols of receiving foreign ambassadors were made stricter. Letters were triple-checked. Gifts were over-prepared. In every ritual exchange was a quiet echo of what Genghis had done when the Khwarezmians dared to draw blood from his messengers. And then there were the soldiers, generations born after the Khwarezmian fall, trained in new methods of warfare, many of them unknowingly mimicking Mongol principles. Like cavalry raids, encirclement, mobility over brute strength. These were innovations born of steppe warfare, and now they were being taught in Damascus, Cairo, and Delhi. Not by Mongols, but by locals who had seen what worked. What had once been considered barbaric had become doctrine. In this way, the defeat near the Indus reshaped warfare across 3 continents. Beyond military influence, there was something subtler, an existential fatigue in the Islamic world, particularly in regions once protected by the Khwarezmian shield. In cities like Nishapur and Balkh, a generation of scholars had vanished. The libraries had burned. The chain of teacher to student, master to apprentice had been broken. The result wasn't just a loss of knowledge. It was a loss of continuity. Philosophy stalled. Scientific progress slowed. Poetry darkened. The golden age dimmed under the weight of trauma. New poets, writing decades later, no longer praised kings or sang of paradise. Their verses turned to mourning, displacement, the fragility of life. Many of these writers were children of survivors, scribes who had learned their trade not in courtly schools, but in exile. They wrote not to glorify, but to endure. And always, in their metaphors, there was a shadow, a vanished army, a river gone red, a silence in the mountains. The Indus became a myth as much as a memory, a symbol of how quickly all things can vanish. Meanwhile, the Mongol world itself began to transform. No longer just warriors, they became governors, architects, patrons of learning. In Persia, under the Ilkhanate, cities were rebuilt, sometimes atop the ashes of those they had destroyed. Mongol rulers converted to Islam, married local women, and adopted Persian as the language of administration. Ironically, the very people they had once crushed now supplied them with legitimacy. But even as Mongol rulers became Muslims, they did not forget the rules that brought them power. They still punished treachery without hesitation. They still rewarded loyalty with brutal consistency. And they still remembered what had happened to the Khwarezmians. Not because they mourned it, but because it had proven a point. Fear, when applied at scale, had generational consequences. For the Mongols, the Indus ambush was never about Jalal al-Din or his soldiers. It was about precedent. It had shown the world that they could not be trifled with, that a single insult could bring down an empire, that geography, religion, terrain, and numbers meant nothing when faced with organized fury. Centuries later, when Timur, the Central Asian conqueror who claimed descent from Genghis, rose to power, he studied the Khwarezmian campaign in detail. He replicated its tactics, its speed, its message. When he razed cities, he didn't do it in a fog of war. He did it with precision. When he ordered the construction of skull pyramids from the dead of Delhi or Aleppo, he did so not out of madness, but calculation. He understood what the Khan had understood. Annihilation has purpose. But Timur, for all his violence, still lived in a different age. He conquered in a world already shaped by Mongol legacy. Genghis had done more than defeat enemies. He had reset the psychological architecture of civilization. The ambush at the Indus wasn't the end of an empire. It was the beginning of a new kind of fear. Even as the Mongol Empire eventually fractured, its methods persisted. Russian princes, Chinese warlords, Persian shahs, all adopted aspects of Mongol governance, logistics, and warfare. The unification of trade routes across Eurasia under Mongol rule, the Pax Mongolica, would eventually allow for the spread of gunpowder, printing, and plague. The modern world, in many ways, emerged from the wreckage Genghis left behind. But if one were to ask where the world first realized what the Mongols were capable of, they would not point to Beijing, not to Baghdad, not to the steppes of Mongolia. They would point to a narrow valley by the Indus River, to the day when sunlight pierced the armor of 100,000 men, to the hour when orders stopped making sense, to the minute when a prince leapt into a river, fleeing a silence louder than war. There, in the dirt and blood, the future was born. By the late 14th century, the site of the Indus ambush had no name, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had never been given one. It had always been a transitory space, a gap between realms, a stretch of barren land on the edge of empires. Yet its silence now carried more weight than any citadel. Travelers who passed through it in later generations often reported strange sensations, unnatural stillness, a prickling sense that something terrible had happened there. Herds of animals avoided it. Even the wind, they claimed, moved differently. The bones were long gone, scattered by scavengers, buried by time, or used as fertilizer in nearby farms that had since reclaimed the land. No gravestones marked the tens of thousands who had died there. Their swords rusted, their helmets flattened, their banners devoured by soil and age. But still, something lingered, not just in the ground, but in the conversations of those who lived near it. Tales told in hushed tones beside campfires. Stories of a river once red, of a thunder with no sky, of an army that screamed without sound. By now, the Mongol conquests were themselves becoming memory. The Khans who followed Genghis had shifted from firebrands to administrators. In China, the Yuan dynasty had risen and fallen. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had disintegrated into rival factions. But the weight of the earlier terror persisted like smoke in stone. No single event encapsulated that terror like the ambush near the Indus. Not because of its size alone, but because of its clarity. It was war refined to its most decisive form. There had been no second chances, no confusion, no ambiguity. It was the purest example of Mongol strategy turned into annihilation. Even centuries later, military scholars from Islamic, European, and Indian traditions referenced it, though often indirectly. Treatises on warfare began to include cautionary sections. Do not pursue a retreating enemy without scouting the terrain, or beware the feigned retreat. These lessons were not abstract. They were shadows of what had happened that day. In the Mongol manuals themselves, compiled and passed down through lineages of commanders and warlords, the Indus ambush served as one of the earliest and most complete demonstrations of layered deception, controlled timing, and kill zone orchestration. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was not military. It was metaphysical. In Sufi literature, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, the collapse of Khwarezm and the massacre of the Indus became allegories for divine punishment, cosmic justice against arrogance, a flood against pride. Shah Muhammad II was no longer just a failed ruler. He became a symbol of hubris. His rejection of diplomacy was cited as spiritual blindness. His death in exile became a parable. Jalal al-Din, in contrast, was interpreted in many mystical circles not as a failed general, but as a seeker, one who lost his kingdom, leapt into the river of death, and wandered in exile, stripped of all but his will. His survival was not military victory. It was existential purification. In Persian poetry, metaphors of rivers often echoed the industry, not just as a geographic feature, but as a boundary between eras, between pride and humility, between empire and oblivion. The river itself became a kind of border to the underworld. Crossing it, or being swallowed by it, carried spiritual weight. And all of that stemmed from a real, precise day of combat in 1221. As time moved forward and the early modern age began, the Mongol legacy splintered into cultural threads. Some were remembered for their brutality. Others, like the Timurids or later the Mongols, inherited and rebranded Mongol heritage as lineage of divine right and imperial greatness. But all of them carried an awareness, spoken or unspoken, that their existence was made possible because another empire had been destroyed to the root. The Khwarezmian collapse remained a vacuum, a ghost space in the political memory of Central Asia. No one claimed to revive it. No dynasty adopted its titles. Unlike the Abbasids, or the Sassanians, or the Byzantines, who were frequently revived in name and in fiction, the Khwarezmians had no such return. The loss had been too thorough, too final. They were remembered not as a glorious civilization, but as a warning. In Western Europe, where tales of the Mongol invasions reached late, the Indus battle was often absorbed into larger myths. The Tartars, as they were often called, were seen as biblical punishments, harbingers of apocalypse. Monks scribbled accounts based on distorted versions of Persian and Arabic stories, turning the Indus ambush into a battle between Christians and demons, or framing it as a sign of the end times. The true nature of the event was lost to most outside Asia. But the all remained. Back in the East, among the nomads of the steppe, the story persisted in another form. Elders told their children not just of victories, but of discipline, of the day Genghis tested his doctrine and found it flawless. It was a moment they didn't romanticize, they respected it. The greatest glory, after all, was not just to kill, but to shape history so that others never dared to stand against you. The valley itself, by now overgrown and unmarked, carried no stone inscription. But maps began to include gaps where Khwarezm had once been. Not territories, not frontiers, just blankness, as if the cartographers themselves had agreed. This place does not return. And so the Indus ambush became something rare in human history. Not a battle that changed who ruled, but a moment that redefined what could be done. A demonstration that armies could vanish, that geography could be turned against its owners, that a leader, disrespected once, could answer not with war, but with systemic extinction. From that moment forward, all diplomacy with the Mongols was colored by it. All resistance was measured against it. And all history that followed, every khanate, every rebellion, every surrender, carried within it the faint, silent weight of that single, ruinous day. By the 16th century, the contours of the world had transformed yet again. Gunpowder had spread across continents. Empires rose in Istanbul, Delhi, Isfahan, and Moscow, each with new rulers, new banners, and new ambitions. Yet beneath these changes ran an older current, quiet but persistent. The legacy of total war, perfected in an age before cannons, when the Mongols had shown the world what annihilation looked like. That memory remained etched not in monuments, but in instinct, in the bazaars of Herat, in the madrasas of Shiraz, even in the desert caravans of the Khwarezmian trade routes. When elders spoke of the time, when whole peoples vanished, they were not referencing myth. They spoke of Khwarezm, not in defiance, but in fear. They spoke of the sudden collapse, the fire that came not from God, but from the steppe, and of the blood that had once turned a mighty river red. They no longer told the story with names and dates. They told it with silence, with pauses, the kind of pauses that happen when history is not just past, but unresolved. Even as modern warfare began to evolve, with organized formations and siege artillery replacing nomadic speed, generals still studied Mongol tactics. In the courts of Babur and Akbar, the founding emperors of the Mongol Empire, military academies and councils returned again and again to what Genghis had done in the early 13th century. The Mongols claimed descent from both Timur and Genghis. Their identity was shaped by that heritage, less a boast, more a warning to enemies. But even they, with their cannons and courts, tread carefully through the lands once scarred by the Khwarezmian fall. They understood what had happened on the banks of the Indus was not just conquest, it was the surgical removal of a threat, an army unmade in the space of a single sun's passage. For the region itself, the site of the massacre remained geographically vague, known only by travelers, raiders, and a few shepherd tribes who grazed flocks along the stony ridges. A place with no written name, passed down only through oral memory. The killing plain, the ghost valley, the river place. No state preserved it. No shrine was ever built. But stories of disappearances, of buried metal, of strange dreams in the night, filtered from those who camped nearby. And with each century, the shape of the event changed. Not the facts, but the meaning. In early Persian historiography, it was a tragedy. In Ottoman war councils, it became a case study. In Mongol descendants' lore, it became divine order, a moment when arrogance met reckoning. In Indian epics adapted centuries later, the fleeing prince became a mythical archetype, a warrior who rides into doom, then dives into a sacred river to be reborn on the other side. Yet through all these retellings, the central fact remained: 70,000 armed men, supported by hundreds of carts, officers, aides, and auxiliary troops, were cut down with precision by an enemy that moved not like an army, but like a force of nature. No kingdom before or after would suffer such loss in such condensed time. Not Carthage, not Rome, not even the cities razed by Timur or the battlefields of Napoleonic Europe. Because this was not merely a defeat, it was disintegration. The reason it endured was not just because of scale. It endured because it exposed something universally feared: how fragile power really is. That a sovereign empire with palaces, wealth, scholars, soldiers, trade, and fortresses could evaporate before it even understood what was happening. That a single strategic misstep, insulting the wrong envoy, could erase centuries of development. It became a lesson that transcended politics. It entered the realm of philosophy. Political theorists, especially in later Persian works under Safavid rule, began to draw moral conclusions from the Khwarezmian demise. They saw it not merely as a geopolitical failure, but a failure of ethics. Arrogance, cruelty to envoys, abuse of trust, centralization of power without understanding of external threats. In a way, they studied the fall of Khwarezm not to understand the Mongols, but to better understand themselves. Still, the ghost of Jalal al-Din lingered. His leap into the Indus was interpreted by mystics and revolutionaries as an act of defiance, even transcendence. In Kashmiri poetry and Punjabi folklore, he was reimagined as a cursed hero, a man who dared swim away from destiny, chased not just by arrows, but by history itself. Over time, the historical prince blurred into a folkloric archetype: the last lion, the river warrior, he who ran through fire. In this way, the ambush at the Indus became a fissure in time, a place where empire, legend, war, and memory intersected with terrible clarity. No modern battlefield has matched its impact. No modern war has erased a state so fully, so quickly, with such finality. And though the exact path of those Mongol detachments has long been lost, though no grave holds the bones of the 70,000, their silence continues. In a valley somewhere between the rocks and riverbeds of modern Pakistan, history still hides its greatest single-day loss, unmarked, unmourned, but never unfelt. Because even now, the world carries its shape. In every doctrine that warns against overconfidence, in every war manual that teaches terrain analysis, in every envoy treated with caution, the wind still moves differently there. Not out of magic, but out of memory.